Hello and welcome to the podcast Byzantium and Friends. I'm Anthony, your host. I want you to think about TV shows that operate on two parallel narrative registers. Usually these run for a number of seasons. Actually, the one I have in mind is The X-Files, because that's when I first became aware of this technique. So there was the Monster of the Week episodes, which were relatively discreet. Story was wrapped up by the end of the episode, at most 2 episodes. And it focused on something usually local. But behind it was operating this larger narrative. I think it was about the U.S. government colluding with aliens to do something, whatever. And you only got a dribble of it in each individual episode, though some episodes focused mostly on that. And that's how that one advanced in the background over the course of many series. It's a very common way for shows to be organized. I'm just rewatching the show Lucifer now, which does that as well. So this is a little bit what goes on in many Balkan historiographies. And we're going to be focusing here specifically on what they have said about Byzantium. And the countries that we're talking about are those whose medieval history in one way or another has to pass through the Eastern Roman Empire in order to get to the full emergence of the modern nation. So we're talking about Turkey and Greece and Bulgaria and Serbia and Romania and other countries, but mostly those. So there's a great deal of specialized research that happens that comes out of these countries, historical research, and it focuses on particular issues. And to that degree, it is pretty much equivalent to that from any other country, especially if it has passed through an international peer review system. Though occasionally in those studies, you will see a glimmer in the background, perhaps, of the national mythos of that country. And I'm referring specifically to the narratives that the modern nations have constructed about their origins and about how they got from those origins to the present. Those origins are in very many cases recorded in medieval Greek sources, and so they are inevitably entangled in Byzantine scholarship. And these narratives are they're like separate mythologies almost. They present history in such different and incompatible ways that they might as well be talking about different universes. The Turkish historical narrative that was kind of invented and promulgated by Ataturk, the modern Greek ideas about continuity and, the Hellenic race and so forth, and you name it. So each of these countries has a very distinctive background story. The Romanian one is particularly interesting. And sometimes even in the specialized studies, you will find sort of allusions to these, or they come up in the last paragraphs, or they're kind of hidden in the background but implied. And sometimes there are books that just are out and out statements of the national mythos. So these are very often prestigious multi-volume histories of the country in question, published by an esteemed Academy of Sciences, authored by the most prominent historians in the leading universities. Sometimes these people are also politicians. These narratives are taught in schools. They are the kind of official story that local newspapers and the local political scene, they kind of have to generally abide by that narrative or promulgate it, but to local audiences, not international ones. They're largely meant for local consumption. They very rarely make the jump from the local national scene to an international scientific audience. They rarely ever make it into international textbooks. So this naturally creates a sense of unease among international scholarly audience. Even when you're reading the more specialized studies, are you getting something that is designed to promote the national mythos, even if it's not directly stated or kind of overtly included as the point of the whole exercise? And here's where the topic that we will be discussing today intersects very well with the previous episode that I posted, 101, on the topic of decolonizing Byzantine studies with Ben and Mirella, in the sense that many scholars believe that it is nationalism that has colonized Byzantine studies. In other words, that nationalism is part of the problem of why Byzantium looks so distorted in so many studies or overall, and others who believe that Byzantium is actually complicit in forging these national narratives, and it certainly has been mustered to do that, and so to that degree, it and its sources are the colonizing force here. Let's remember that to a degree and at certain times, it was an empire. So my guest today to help us sort all of this out is Diana Mishkova, who is a professor of history at the Center for Advanced Study in Sofia, Bulgaria. And she's written a truly extraordinary book called Rival Byzantiums, Empire and Identity in Southeastern Europe. Now, Diana is not per se a Byzantinist, but more a scholar and historian of modern nation building, especially in Southeastern Europe, and she's written a number of topics about this. And this is her turn from a modern standpoint to looking at how Byzantium has been marshaled and used in producing national narratives in the countries that I mentioned earlier. All of these narratives are not consistent with each other, obviously, but they're also often internally diverse. So sometimes countries will have very different narratives, or at different times, different approaches to Byzantium seem more advantageous or suitable. This is an extraordinary book in its clarity and even-handedness. I, for one, could detect no bias for or against any one of these traditions, and I find that extraordinary, especially since I'm also in the book. Anyway, but we won't be talking about that. It is actually a wonderful thing to have a modern historian come and look at some of the narratives that our field has produced and give us a reading of them in their own context. Their own context is not only the medieval sources that they're drawn from or claim to be drawn from, but the modern dynamics that propel them and create them to begin with. Now, I want to say one more thing before I wrap this up. It may seem from the book or from the discussion that we're kind of picking on these national narratives, and when you put nationalism and the Balkans together, a certain kind of picture comes to mind. So I just wanted to state very clearly for the record that whatever distortions these narratives have perpetrated for their own modern purposes, they are nothing compared to the distortion that Western European scholars have perpetrated against the Eastern Roman Empire for 1,000 years, and continued to do so until probably the mid-20th century. The early 20th century was a peak of Western fantasy and irrationalism about the Eastern Empire, with all kinds of racial ideas and Orientalism and decadence and all of these things just piling up onto a millennium of distortion and misrepresentation. So we're not just picking on the Balkan countries and their national obsessions here. And let me say, for example, that, and this is not in the book, this is just myself speaking, that Western European countries and their institutions continue to perpetrate their own mythos about Byzantium. I won't talk about it in detail here, but there's plenty of identity politics that's still going on everywhere. Anyway, I have said enough. Let's get straight to my conversation with Diana. But first, let me thank medievalist.net again for reposting all of these episodes on their site. Here's my conversation with Diana Mishkova. Diana, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Anthony, for having me. Thank you very much indeed.
So it's good to see you, well, in person, at least insofar as Zoom allows, because I've been reading your work for some time, but I thought this was the best opportunity to have you on. Now, you're not like a technical Byzantinist, which is why I find your perspective on the historiography so interesting. Can you tell us a little bit about your own research background and what kinds of sort of training and expertise and research you're coming from and that you're bringing to the historiography on Byzantium. So, and what brought you to this topic?
Well, nation building and nationalism in Southeastern Europe is an overwhelming field of research, which can be and has been approached from very different angles. My preferred vintage point to this field has been that of intellectual history and the history of historiography or history writing, which are essential components of research in the formation of nations and national identity. So how the nation is represented, how its origins, aspirations, and claims are authorized and narrated. This is what actually continues to drive my engagement with this research field over the last almost couple of decades. My latest book in this respect is not an exception. It deals not with Byzantium or Byzantine history per se, but with the way national historians of the modern Balkan quote-unquote successor states to the empire, that is Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, Romania, and Turkey, have operated with the topos of Byzantium, and how in doing so they have been shaping the national canons of history in these countries. All this means, as I see it, exposing the national stakes of Byzantine studies, the way this field partakes in changing the understanding and writing of history, national history in particular. National histories generally treat the Middle Ages as the period of the genesis of modern nations. And since the medieval history of the Balkan societies and states was largely shaped in and by their relations with Byzantium, so the question about the empire's role and impact came to be implicated heavily in issues like collective identity, historical rights, national patrimony, culture, mentality, in brief, in the definition of the collective self. Yeah. And as such, Byzantium has always functioned as an agglomerate of ideologically harnessed understandings and a point of reference structuring the national grand narratives. My interest, therefore, concerns the mirrored reflections, not the historical reality of Byzantium. These reflections are also historical facts, but they belong less to the history of the Byzantine Empire than to that of modern historiography. In some way, the book is an exploration. The book that was recently published on these national interpretations of Byzantium in the Balkan by the Balkan historiographies. It is an exploration, in a sense, of the politics of Byzantine studies. That is, of the images and understandings this field has been cultivating during the last 2.5 centuries in the countries of Southeastern Europe. But in another way, it is also a critical interrogation of Byzantium as a historiographical construct with considerable ideological potential in shaping a national history and national identity.
You know, I read your book at exactly the right time, because I am currently working on a book on Western perceptions and the creation of Western ideas of Byzantium, though ranging from late antiquity down to World War II. So we overlap in the last few centuries that, of that project.
And glad to hear.
I should reiterate that, for all that critical interrogations of sort of Balkan views of Byzantium, make them sound very problematic, Western constructions are just as problematic, if not more so, in their own ways. And so we're not singling out anybody here, but critical research like this should be comprehensive. I also want to say that your work is not just, though it can be seen that way, as a study of like the reception of Byzantium, though it is in part that. It's also an inquiry into the framework in which a lot of research takes place in these countries. So it's not just like, oh, look at how these Byzantine themes appear on that play, for example, that was staged, whenever, which is much more of a reception kind of study. But that scholars are actually conducting research within these frameworks. Now, in these countries, so it's important to be clear here, you're not just focusing on countries, but on, or all the research that takes place in them, but constructions of Byzantium that are following some kind of national narrative. In all of these countries, there are people who do history independently of those narratives or who are critical of them. So this is not like a blanket, right, approach to everybody here, but to constructions of historiography that are related to national priorities. Some of which are very powerful and dominant in some countries and some others less so, depending. Now, this is something that you don't talk about in the book, but I was wondering if you could fill me in. You probably know this, very well. Like, what are the kinds of institutions that promote that kind of national historiography, that where, we're going to present an image of Byzantium that is consistent with our own national history? So what are kind of the institutions that do that in these countries?
Well, the brief answer is a broad range and a variety of institutions, crucial first for the legitimization of the nation state, and which later have been charged with the task of creating and fostering national consciousness and identity. And these are above all the centralized educational agencies, from ministries of education, which are tasked with producing and supervising the educational curriculum and the history school books, to national academies of sciences and universities, which have been crucial in the process of historical canon building and its scholarly authorization. So we are actually talking of a close relationship between state institutions, scholarship, and the prospects for academic career. State support for, or even better, direct political involvement of individual historians were decisive for their elevation to the rank of national historians, and thus creators of the dominant versions of national historiographies. It is also telling that the professionalization of history writing and the introduction of the scientific, that is positivist method in the second half of the 19th century did not entail a radical shift in the dominant historiographical discourse. Many historians saw, and some still see, no discrepancy between history as an academic endeavor and history as a service to the nation. In fact, many historians in Southeastern Europe combined the roles of scholars and politicians as members of parliament, as ministers, even prime ministers.
Yeah.
And here the names of Nikolai Iorga in Greece, Spiridon Lambros Nikolai Iorga in Romania, Spiridon Lambros in Greece, Bogdan Filov in Bulgaria, or Mehmet Fuat Köprülü in Turkey easily come to mind.
Yeah.
Turkish historiography is a good example in this sense, as it clearly illustrates the paramountcy of the nation-state framework in the production of knowledge. The late Ottoman imperial historiography and art history were pluralistic. They were open to admitting connections to Byzantium on different levels. But the establishment of the Turkish Republic in 1922 put an end to this plurality of opinion. The Turkish Historical Society, which was set up in 1930 under the patronage of Kemal Atatürk, the founder and first president of the Republican Turkey, effectively institutionalized the Kemalist version of history, the so-called Turkish history thesis, which worked to forge a new, entirely Turco-centric historical consciousness among the Turks, as opposed to their previous imperial and mostly religiously framed identity, and which virtually monopolized historical scholarship. And one of the enduring effects of all this was rejecting the existence of any formative Byzantine influence on the Ottoman institutions, on Ottoman art and architecture, so that the country that inherited most of the Byzantine material culture saw the setting up of the first privately funded Center for Byzantine Studies only in 2015, 8 years ago.
Yes, wow. So most of my audience resides in predominantly English-speaking countries. Mm-hmm. And but they have backgrounds from all over the world, and especially from Southeastern Europe. But let's just assume that they don't know the competing national myths of the countries in question, and perhaps cannot understand why you can say a single sentence about a fort or the ethnicity of one person in the 12th century and start a war between, I don't know, Bulgarians and Romanians, but it is possible to do that. I've gotten caught in the crossfire. I don't know. I used a word which one side thought was wrong and whatever. Anyway, could you give us some examples of, what national narratives about Byzantium might look like, or particular claims that they might make in these different countries, just to give a sense of what kinds of narratives we're talking about, and also their variety and how they conflict? We don't have to get into that too much detail, but many of our audience members won't know exactly what we're talking about until we give them some concrete particulars.
Well, yeah, okay. I can try to single out some of the most formative national myths in these cultures and historiographies. By the way, just a note to this kind of historiographical conflicts. Now I'm working on a volume. It's going to be a collective volume that precisely discusses the historiographical wars in the Balkans, and the first volume will be devoted to medieval topics. That is, how these historiographic wars unfolded on the ground of the medieval history. But okay, so if I go back to your question, I would say that for the Greeks, this must be the myth of an eternal Greece. That is, of the uninterrupted continuity of the Greek nation from ancient to modern Greece, where Byzantium serves as the middle bond, therefore as a Greek state. Greek in the racial sense of the word, even when it is rhetorically camouflaged as Greek in culture only.
Agreed.
So Bulgarians, Serbs, Romanians, and Turks, even when portraying Byzantium as their prime adversary, all contested the Greeks' claim that it belonged to them alone. That was uniform tendency. A corresponding enduring Romanian myth is the uninterrupted continuity of the Romanians as a Latin race from the time of the Roman conquests north of the Danube River to the present day. In other words, as representing the West in the East. And this is a long-standing myth in Romanian historiography and historical culture generally. On such grounds, many Romanian historians considered the medieval Romanian principalities to be the only rightful inheritor to the Roman glory, and the true Byzantium after Byzantium, which means Byzantine imperial and civilizational continuity via the Romanians, while contesting the role of custodians of the Byzantine legacy to the Bulgarians and the Serbs. The persistent myth in Bulgarian historiography, it's more tricky here, but I would say it is the putative role of Byzantium as the eternal nemesis, the evil demiurge, so to say, of Bulgarian history, which had hindered the organic development of the Bulgarian nation and state. And organic development here implies, among other things, the unification of the so-called Slavs from the Bulgarian group, a mythical community with no trace in the sources, in a single Bulgarian state. As far as Serbia is concerned, a steadily cultivated myth there is the presentation of the medieval kingdom of Stefan Dušan, the 14th century ruler, during whose reign medieval Serbia reached the peak of its political power and territorial expansion, as the potential fresh and vibrant successor of the Eastern Empire, an improved edition of Byzantium. And finally, in the Turkish case, this is obviously the Turkish history thesis I already mentioned, which depicted the Turks as the forerunners of all the nations of Eurasia, the creators of the major Asian civilizations of China, India, Mesopotamia, Egypt, Asia Minor. It also had a linguistic analog, the so-called Sun language theory, which defined the Turkish language as the world's oldest language. A somewhat milder variation of the thesis is the so-called Anatolianism, claiming Turkish autochthony in Anatolia, that is Asia Minor, whereby the Turks had provided the racial stock for the Aegean and Anatolian societies of the ancient era, which the Greeks later abrogated. So it was from such positions that Turkish historians approached Byzantium.
Yeah,
but these also, sorry.
Yes. No. So there you have it. I mean, that's an interesting range of interpretations, and I should add that there are some common tropes to many of these, and your book fleshes them out. I mean, we don't have the time to talk about all of them. As you pointed out, there is a racial element here. Many of these theories are really about racial continuity and or purity, though it's often disguised under other words like culture and so forth. In the Greek case, for example, there was long a kind of allergy to admitting Slavic presence, in the territories of the Greek-speaking, the Greek Empire and so forth. Another trope that one notices is a kind of obsession with the moment of maximum imperial expansion on the part of each state. So Serbians focus on Dušan, Bulgarians focus on Simeon, and that moment of maximum perceived military power or expansion is taken as the kind of archetype, the normative, template for our history, like even today.
The justification of our historical rights.
Yes.
Affirmation of our historical rights. Yeah.
Yes. And this, of course, leads to, I mean, it is both a part of contemporary conflicts and fuels them. For example, about North Macedonia, for example, and the Bulgarian claims to that, and now North Macedonian counters to that, and so forth. So these are very much histories of the present as much as they're talking about Byzantium. I want to pick up on another theme that you mentioned here in connection with the Turkish tradition, which is that about how they deny or tried to deny in the national historiography Byzantine influences on the early Turkish settlers and the Ottomans or the Seljuks before them. So how have the other countries coped with this problem? I mean, in very general terms, their histories kind of run through Byzantium in some ways. Or at least they're very strongly shaped by them culturally, certainly in terms of orthodoxy. So how do they find ways to assert their own cultural superiority while admitting to some degree, yeah, but there's also this kind of Byzantine template. So how do they cope with that problem?
This also evolved over time, and it forms an interesting part of the whole story. If we're talking of general techniques, we can say that on the whole, the positive appropriation of Byzantium was reserved for those of its achievements or imprints that could be effectively nationalized and made to serve a national cause.
Right.
This was certainly true of Greece, which practically devoured, so to say, Byzantium as the medieval phase of its history. As for Bulgaria, Serbia, and Romania, they either talked of stubborn resistance to Byzantine imperialism and of stubbornly pursued national independence, or stressed at the same time or parallelly the assimilative powers of their national cultures. After the Second World War, a shift of perspective took place in these three countries, Bulgaria, Serbia, and Romania, from what Byzantium meant for their societies to what these societies meant for Byzantium and its heritage.
Right.
The major contribution attributed to Byzantium at that time was that of having unleashed, either through rivalry or soft power, the proper creative forces of the medieval Balkan nationalities, and of stirring them to generate cultural values of their own, which they then transmitted to other peoples. And hence the prominence in the scholarly vocabulary of the time after the Second World War of notions like mutual influences, dialogue, symbiosis, but also adaptation, transformation, and assimilation of political and cultural transfers. In fact, the most prominent medievalists and Byzantinists of the time, while admitting the powerful impact of Byzantium, devoted the best part of their work to demonstrate the originality and creativity involved in the respective national assimilation of the Byzantine paragon, in conceptual opposition to notions like importation, imitation, and emulation. Yet at the end of the day, whatever the admitted influences, all these cultures are said to have remained true to the essence of their proper traditions, so that the outcome invariably was a unique Greek, a unique Bulgarian, Serbian, Romanian, or Turkish culture, or, as it was more often claimed, civilization.
Yeah, another trope that I noticed was, along the lines of what you were saying, claiming certain key figures as being sort of ethnically or racially your own people who are just appear in a Byzantine guise in the sources. This is done very often for many emperors, where you claim, no, this person is really secretly a fill in the blank, or Cyril and Methodius, right, or whatever.
Exactly.
And so you can loop the Byzantine influence back into something that came from you in the first place. That's very common too. Now, one of the other interesting themes of your book, and I'm really glad that you did this, because it would have been impossible to talk about these historiographies on their own, but it would have been missing a big part of the picture, which is that their views of Byzantium are also mediated through Western historiographical traditions that they're getting, and largely the kind of negative view of the Enlightenment, the sort of Montesquieu-Gibbon approach, but not only that. And so they're having to not only cope with the Byzantine sources that they're dealing with, their own national narrative, but somehow they have to filter these through the Western models that they're getting. So it creates this very complex, multi-layered situation. Could you give us just a couple of examples of how this works? And pick the traditions. That doesn't matter because you're pretty consistent about dealing with this in the book in every chapter. But give us some examples here of how those different traditions all kind of filter each other.
Yes, actually, I would pick up the Greek and the Turkish cases as particularly striking in this respect. That is making very graphic this kind of interplay between Western and local national interpretations. The influence of Western Enlightenment thought, as you mentioned, on the way Byzantium was conceptualized in first, originally in late 18th to mid-19th century Greece, it can be abundantly attested. For the Enlightenment thinkers who regarded with contempt the medieval age generally, Byzantium became, as you all know, the epitome of everything the age of reason disdained: despotism, religious fanaticism, irrationalism, political corruption, whatnot. To a very large extent, the views of the leading Greek intellectuals in the first half of the 19th century were shaped by the Western fascination with the Greek antiquity, the political face of which was, of course, Western Philhellenism, on the one hand, and the related Western Enlightenment scorn for Byzantium. And this can be very, very clearly attested in the writings of people like Adamantios Korais, for example, who is considered to be the founder of Greek national ideology. These Greek intellectuals, most of them liberal nationalists and republicanists and anti-clericalists, looked to classical Greece, not Byzantium, as the paragon for their country's modern development. For them, the medieval phase of Greek history was one of humiliating subjugation by the Romans, of orientalization and degradation of the Greek nation. So both the myth of an eternal Greece and the Greek horror of being Oriental were thus foreign importations, yet both had a momentous impact on the modern Greek self-understanding. And it is remarkable, again, that it was foreign views, in this case above all the English and German Romantic tradition, preoccupied as it was with the idea of historical continuity, that were responsible for introducing the portrayal of Byzantium as a bridge uniting ancient Greece to modern Greece, and asserting the continuity of Greek history and Hellenism in the Hegelian sense of a Hellenic genius. As such, these Western historians became cherished point of reference for Greek national historians. So the portrayal of Byzantium as a Greek empire was already forged by Western historians before it came to dominate a Greek national Romantic historiography. The influence of the Western views on Turkish historiography of Byzantium is of different nature, and it concerns above all the Byzantine contribution to the making of the Ottoman Empire. It is mainly in this respect that Turkish historiography perhaps more strongly felt the influences of Western views. It should be noted that in the first half of the 20th century, there existed a wide consensus in Western literature and European Orientalist scholarship in particular, which denied the capacity of the Turks, a nomadic nation, to establish a durable and robust empire. The Ottoman Empire, it was held, owed its expanding power and creative force to an Islamic Byzantine amalgam, where the Christian element, that is the Greek and Balkan Slavic converts to Islam, was by far the more important element, ensuring the continuity of Byzantine institutions and administrative practices under an Islamic guise. In other words, whatever creative force there was in the Ottomans was attributed to a European element, while the Ottoman Empire appeared as a Muslim Roman empire of sorts. So it was in confrontation, in an attempt to defy this notion, in confrontation with this opinion, that the Turkish, so to say, negationist response came about, which denied any direct or formative Byzantine influence on the public institutions, administrative practices, art or architecture of the Ottoman Empire. They all were said to derive fully from pre-Islamic or pre-Ottoman Muslim traditions and models. To this day, this view is the dominant one in Turkish historiography. So we can see that, just to mention these two cases, in both the Greek and the Turkish case, Western views played a decisive role in the crystallization of the national historical narrative about Byzantium. Now, in the Bulgarian and Serbian cases, on the other hand, Russian scholarship was vital in asserting, especially in asserting the crucial role that the Slavs had played in regenerating and perpetuating Byzantium. All in all, however, for most of the time, extra-regional Byzantine research, Western and Russian, as we can see, was colored by political leanings.
Yes, and they interact in strange ways. And in some periods, it's Western models that are dominant. Like in Greece, for example, as you mentioned, in the early 19th century, it's straight up this European Enlightenment model that we, don't want to be associated with Byzantium. We want everyone to see us as descendants of the ancient Greeks, and then you reach all the way back. But in the mid-19th century, then you face another problem, which is like the Fallmerayer challenge, where you now have to distinguish yourself from Slavs. You're like, no, we're not Slavs. But in order to do that, you have to engage with Byzantium. Now you have to make that Greek so that you don't be seen as emerging from a quasi-Slavic template. And it's like, no, Byzantium is entirely Greek. And there were a few Slavs, but we Hellenized them. So these traditions kind of interact in these strange diachronic ways.
Yeah,
you're quite right about that.
It is especially interesting that the Fallmerayer case is interesting because, similar to the Turkish, it was it provoked such a strong reaction on the part of the Greek historians that reverberated for decades and decades and decades on. It is indeed interesting that it was precisely in the massive effort on the part of the Greek historians to refute Fallmerayer's thesis that the Greek grand national narrative actually took shape.
Yes. Yeah. A friend of mine, a correspondent, has called it a shotgun marriage or a shotgun wedding. So this is when, you know the expression, right?
Yeah.
That's like, we didn't really want this thing, but we had to, we were forced to. So now we have to live together. And I mean, my personal view is that this resulted in a fairly weak consensus. In all of my life, that I've been talking about these issues, I have found that about half Greeks are not convinced by this narrative, which is a pretty high rate of failure. But anyway, whatever. So some of the traditions that you talk about are very favorable toward Byzantium, obviously the Greek one. Some are mostly favorable, some are unfavorable. But can you talk about a case that seems to have a very mixed kind of love-hate relationship with Byzantium, like a national tradition that never quite made up its mind how it's supposed to deal with the elephant in the room, or whatever we want to call it?
Yeah. I think it is hard to speak of chronologically neat alterations between love and hate. But among the Balkan heirs of Byzantium, perhaps Bulgaria best exemplifies this love-hate relationship in different periods. for example, the hostile, the inimical treatment of Byzantium clearly prevailed throughout the 19th and the first half of the 20th century. But after the Second World War, a shift took place to unraveling the two-way interactions and influences between the Bulgarians and the Slavs more generally, and Byzantium. Most recently, there has been a tendency in Bulgarian historiography of presenting medieval Bulgaria as a Byzantium within Byzantium. But I can also observe a certain synchronic love-hate relationship where Byzantium can feature as the arch enemy of medieval Bulgaria in the political sphere, and at the same time as a benefactor in the cultural sphere.
Right.
On the whole, we should say that the strongly affective attitude to Byzantium in the Bulgarian case should not surprise, because for 7 centuries, the medieval Bulgarian ethnos, statehood, and culture were being formed in constant close interaction and frequent confrontation with the Byzantine Empire. And how to deal with this overwhelming presence and civilizational entanglement with Byzantium has ever been a major challenge for the Bulgarian historians.
Yeah, in many of your chapters, it appears that these discussions of Byzantium, especially as a political threat, you mentioned the Bulgarian case here, are surrogate discussions of the Greek imperialism, especially in the 19th century and in the Balkan Wars and World War I and so forth. Now, just to explain what I mean, is that, Greek expansionism stopped 100 years ago, in fact, to the year. But for the first century of its existence, Greece was trying to, in its own mind, liberate as many Greeks or Orthodox, whatever, people from the Ottoman Empire, and expanded fairly successfully to the limits where it is today, starting out from a much smaller core after the revolution. But during this process of expansion, other emerging Balkan nation states were threatened, and there were conflicts, the Balkan Wars and so forth. And so this caught up discussions of Byzantium again. I read about this. The first real exposure I had to it was Paul Stevenson's book on the legacy of Basil II, where he talks about, right, so Basil II is kind of this model for Greek expansionism in 100 years ago, during the Balkan Wars. Can you give some examples of how other historiographies kind of coped with sort of Byzantium as Greece? Like, how was that configured?
You mean in opposition to the Roman label, or?
No, I don't think that is seeing Byzantium through the lens of modern Greece.
Oh, I see.
As a political danger.
As a political danger, yes. Well, as it often happens, the anxieties of the present provide the view of the past. The negative attitude to Byzantium in Bulgaria and Turkey, I already touched upon, tallies with the tense political relations, respectively, between Bulgaria and Greece, all the way from the mid-19th to the mid-20th century, and between the Ottoman Empire and later Turkey and Greece from the early 19th century to this very day. I think, and I argue in my book, that the appropriation or Hellenization of Byzantium by modern Greece has much to do with it, since it supposedly validated the projection of controversies unfolding in the present on a distant past. The claim that Byzantine history was actually Greek history was adopted by many Bulgarian scholars in confirmation of their attitude to Byzantium as a Greek power hostile to their nascent nation state. The conflation between Byzantines and Greeks in the Bulgarian narrative was instrumental in mobilizing the Bulgarians' resentment towards the contemporary Greeks by pointing to the age-old confrontation between the two nations. All in all, as you said, the Greek appropriation of the empire's cultural legacy and their insistence on the medieval roots of the Greek nationalist program, the so-called Megali Idea or Great Idea, reinforced the Bulgarian and Turkish writers' rejection of all things Byzantine. Thus, ironically, Bulgaria, the most heavily Byzantinized Balkan country, and Turkey, the actual successor to the empire, ended up as the most fierce, the fiercest detractors of Byzantium. So here we can see how important all these contemporary concerns, contemporary confrontations were for the way Byzantium was approached, was studied and represented.
Now, you mentioned earlier the Roman issue, and I'd like us to talk a little bit about that too. Now, as you know, I've taken a stand that this is a Roman state. Its subjects are, for the most part, Romans. By the way, this allows me to sidestep all of these issues. Like, I don't have to take a stand at all in any of these national controversies because they're, and I don't do that instrumentally. It's because that's what I find in the sources. So all of these, for me, all of these national anxieties are, for the most part, moot. But I found it fascinating how the different traditions coped with the Roman evidence that Byzantium left behind, which seemed to be very sort of contradictory in many ways. I found the Romanian case particularly interesting. I was wondering if you could say a little bit about that.
Yeah, as I already mentioned, by and large, briefly, the way the Bulgarian historiography instrumentalized the Greek label, especially during its Romantic phase. Yes, the Romanian case is an interesting one indeed. The Transylvanian or Latinist school, which dominated Romanian history writing for a very long period of time, from the late 18th century to the last quarter of the 19th century. So this school took up the task to demonstrate the Latin purity and continuity of the Romanian race. For them, the transformation of the Roman Empire into a Greek or Romaic state in the 7th century, when the newly established Bulgarian state separated the Latin speakers, that is the Romanians, from the body of the eastern part of the empire and made the Greeks its only masters. So this transformation meant for them Greek usurpation of the name Roman and of the role of custodians of the empire. The Greeks, these Romanian historians held, had dubbed Latins the people of the left bank of the Danube River and those of the west in order to pose as Romans, while in fact they were subjects and not blood descendants of the Romans, unlike the Romanians and the Italians, from whom they actually stole the empire by deceit. Accordingly, the Romanian Latinists called Byzantium an Eastern Empire, or simply the East, the kingdom of the Greeks or the Romaic. For them, therefore, Byzantium was the result of a felony, a theft from the Romanians, who were the true heirs of the Roman glory. A century later, Nicolae Iorga, already mentioned his name, he was the most important Romanian historian in the first half of the 20th century, came up with a different reading of this issue. Iorga held that in neither political nor cultural sense was Byzantium Greek Empire, despite the dominance of the Greek language and the prestige of the Hellenic heritage. He argued that the Romance-speaking populations of Southeastern Europe, who are traditionally counted by Romanian historiography as Romanians, continued to nourish the creative power of the Roman element and the idea of the restitution of the single Roman Empire. This is what Jorge argued. In this perspective, in Jorge's reading, the Romanians appeared as bearers of the same imperial tradition as the Byzantines. Unlike the Bulgarians and the Serbs, they were neither rivals nor imitators of the Roman imperial idea. They were its embodiment and carriers along with the Byzantines. And this is what made the Romanians, in this view, so apt to inherit and perpetuate the Byzantine Roman imperial and cultural tradition after the political demise of the empire. And it also licensed them to envision themselves as destined in more favorable future conditions to remake the Latin Empire of the East.
Yeah, I find fascinating the different ways in which these traditions try to cope with the Roman problem. It's almost a litmus test that tells you what they're trying to get at. And there's so much variation from denying it, which is a standard Western approach to kind of trying to massage it like the Greeks do, because they know about it. It's part of the modern Greek folklore that, they were once Romi, Rome. They know this. They can't deny it as such, but they just try to convert one into the other. Well, it really means Greek, right? So it's like, okay, so we don't have to talk about it, but we're not going to deny it either. And so on. There's a range of responses. I've said this before, but I wonder if Turkish engagement with what we call Byzantium might actually be smoothed a little bit or facilitated from its current. I mean, it's currently not. There are tensions in Turkey right now about Byzantium for obvious political reasons. But if it's seen less as sort of Greek and more as Roman, that might make it less political or something. I hope that it might be easier to deal with it that way. So it's not, the culture of your neighbor with whom you have a difficult relationship. Anyway, this is obviously not an issue for me. I'm just going to keep working on, East Roman Empire itself. But I just find it fascinating as a way of tracking what all these traditions are trying to do. And as I said earlier, let's not forget that the West has perpetuated its own enormous myths about Byzantium. It's not innocent of all of this. So we're not just picking on Balkan nationalities, right? Or whatever. Anyway, we're almost out of time. There's a lot of rich material in your book, and I hope that many of our audience will go and read it. Any final thoughts you want to leave us with?
Well, I would perhaps round up our discussion by stressing once again the huge importance of the ever-shifting, ever-changing present and current concerns of the respective countries and historiographies in molding the way Byzantium is studied, represented, appropriated, or disowned. Changing geopolitical standing, relations with neighbors, requisites of cultural and identity politics, and so on. All these affected crucially the representations of Byzantium. I would surmise that this observation actually applies to Western views of Byzantium as well. One of the fascinating findings of my research was the potency of Byzantium, or rather of its representations, in producing alternative views of the past and the present, and alternative national self-narrations. To some extent, we can attribute it to the polysemic connotations of the very term Byzantium. But to me, more important appears the fact that Byzantium still matters a lot in terms of the political and cultural issues that are at stake for the Balkan societies.
Yes, in fact, your work is not just academic in a narrow sense, but also political. I mean, it has to be, in the sense that these contested histories are very much part of the politics of the present. And if in America right now, like we're seeing this in real time, at the, part of the core of political conflict has to do with what is taught in schools and how American history is taught in schools. And this is like at a level of presidential politics, and also institutional, priorities. Who do you put in charge of educational institutions? What do they teach children about slavery and, and so forth, in the history of America? And in Southeastern Europe, these legacies are very much, and always are, and your book shows this, part of the present discussion about who we are and what we're doing with each other in this corner of Europe here.
As a matter of fact, it is precisely coming back to the very beginning of our discussion. This is precisely the social implications of history teaching, of the study of history, is what really attracts me so unwaveringly to this field. And you can discover newly invented social implications of this. So even if we want to remain more or less academically objective, neutral, as it were, when dealing with the history of historiography, of history writing, we are really committing a very disturbing act. And we cannot avoid being political in this. Yeah.
Well, Diana, your book is very lucid, and I think it's a necessary and very welcome contribution. So thank you for taking the time to look into the history of our field in all of these countries. This is very difficult material to access. I should say that too. So not everybody has all the linguistic skills that you have. So thank you for that.
Thank you.
I look forward to your next book.
Thank you very much, Anthony, again for inviting me on and for the opportunity to introduce to a broader public a little known corpus of literature and little known conceptualizations of Byzantium originating from Southeastern Europe. I look forward to your book on thematizing rather revisiting and interrogating Western scholarship on Byzantium in terms of its ideological, political, and epistemological precepts and foundations. So I also have something very much to look forward to.
You think Balkan nationalists are crazy? Wait until you see French Orientalists or Nazi race theorists. Whoa.
Yeah.
All right, Diana. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much.